35. That is roughly how many of the 307 men Patton sent 50 miles behind German lines actually made it back. The rest were killed, wounded, captured, or simply never accounted for. The mission was supposed to free American prisoners of war. What it actually did, according to Patton's own son-in-law, was very nearly get him killed by his own rescuers before a single German soldier could be blamed for it. We're going to tell you everything about this raid today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows will complicate the version of this story you already know. Now, if you're still here, let's start with the letter Patton wrote his wife the day the mission left, and then we'll get into what actually happened at Hammelburg. This was not supposed to be about one man at all, at least not officially. By late March 1945, Patton's Third Army was driving deep into Germany, and intelligence reports had flagged a prisoner of war camp near the town of Hammelburg, Oflag XIII-B, holding American and Serbian officers roughly 50 miles behind the front line. Patton ordered his 12th Corps commander, Manton Eddy, to have the 4th Armored Division put together a task force and send it directly to the camp to free the prisoners inside. On paper, it was a rescue mission like any other, aimed at getting American officers out from behind enemy lines before the war caught up with them one way or another. By that point in the war, Patton was already a man whose personal judgment had been formally questioned twice before. Once after the slapping incidents in Sicily, and again after his own remarks at Knutsford nearly cost him his command before D-Day. Both of those earlier controversies had at least grown out of Patton's temper and his mouth, flaws that were, however damaging, tied directly to his effectiveness as a blunt, aggressive combat commander. Hammelburg was different in kind rather than degree. It was the one controversy of his career that had nothing to do with winning battles faster or driving his men harder, and everything to do with a decision that put an entire task force at risk for reasons that were, at bottom, personal rather than military. It was not like any other mission, because one of the men Patton knew to be inside that camp was his own son-in-law. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters had married Patton's daughter Beatrice in 1934 and had been captured in Tunisia back in 1943, spending nearly 2 years as a prisoner by the time Patton's tanks reached striking distance of the camp holding him. Patton wrote to his wife on the day the task force left, referencing Waters by name at the camp it was headed toward, a detail that sits awkwardly next to the account Patton gave afterward, in diaries he later made public, claiming he had not actually known Waters was there until after his men had already arrived. He also sent his own personal aide, Major Alexander Stiller, along with the task force, a man who could personally identify Waters on sight the moment they reached him. Command of the raid went to Captain Abraham Baum, a young officer given a force of roughly 307 soldiers, 16 Sherman tanks, 27 half-tracks, 3 self-propelled guns, and a handful of jeeps, drawn mostly from the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion and 10th Armored Infantry Battalion. Baum himself had already earned a reputation within the division as a capable, aggressive junior officer, exactly the kind of commander higher headquarters reached for when a mission needed to move fast and improvise under pressure, though nothing in his prior experience had prepared him for a raid whose actual objective he was not fully briefed on until the task force was already committed to the plan. It was, by any standard measure of the distance and the resistance likely to be encountered along the way, a badly undersized force for what it was being asked to do. 50 miles is a long way to travel through active enemy territory with no secure line back to friendly lines, and nobody involved in planning the mission seems to have seriously worked out how several hundred liberated prisoners were supposed to travel that same 50 miles back out again once the camp gates were actually open. Other officers who reviewed the plan before it launched raised exactly that concern at the time, questioning why a raid meant to liberate potentially thousands of men was being resourced as if it only needed to rescue a few dozen, and getting no real answer beyond orders to proceed as planned. That last problem turned out to be almost as large as the camp itself. Oflag XIII-B held roughly 1,200 American officers and close to 3,000 Serbian officers at the time Task Force Baum reached it, a population that outnumbered the rescue force 10-1 before anyone even accounted for the wounded and the sick among them. A raiding party built around 53 vehicles had no realistic way to move that many men anywhere, on foot or otherwise, in the middle of hostile territory, with German units already converging on the noise of an American armored column driving loose through their rear area. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Task Force Baum left American lines on the night of March 26, 1945, and fought its way toward Hammelburg through the following day, taking losses to ambushes and roadblocks the whole way in, arriving at the camp on March 27th in worse shape than it had left in. German units in the area, alerted almost immediately by the sound and size of an armored column, moving well behind what should have been a quiet rear area, hit the task force repeatedly along its route, with scattered infantry, anti-tank guns, and whatever mobile reserves happened to be nearby, whittling down Baum's vehicles and men mile by mile, before the column had even reached the objective it was sent to liberate. What happened next produced one of the stranger and more painful individual moments of the entire campaign. Inside the camp, the German commandant, General Gunther von Göckel, wanted to arrange a truce rather than fight for a position he judged indefensible, and he asked Waters himself to go out and negotiate it, trusting a senior American prisoner to carry the message to the approaching column. Waters agreed, and walked out from the camp with a small party that included a German officer, heading toward the American vehicles to explain that the garrison wanted to surrender rather than fight. A German soldier who had not been told any of that was still holding a position nearby, saw armed men approaching in the confusion, and opened fire before the officer accompanying Waters could explain what was actually happening. Waters was hit and went down, shot through the hip, wounded not by the men he had spent 2 years as a prisoner of, but in the last few minutes before his own side's tanks reached the wire, by a German conscript who had no idea a truce was even being discussed. He was carried back into the camp and treated by Serbian doctors, who were themselves prisoners there, still recovering from the wound when Baum's men actually broke through the gate shortly afterward. The irony of it did not escape the men who witnessed it and wrote about it afterward, that a man who had survived 2 years as a German prisoner without serious physical harm came closer to dying in the final chaotic minutes before his own liberation than at almost any other point in his captivity. Shot not by a guard enforcing the camp's discipline, but by a soldier reacting on pure reflex to an armored column that had appeared out of nowhere in what should have been a quiet stretch of rear area Germany. By the time Task Force Baum reached Waters, the operation had already used up most of what it had brought with it in fuel, ammunition, and manpower to fight its way in. Baum's men freed as many prisoners as they physically could load onto the vehicles that were still running, and turned back toward American lines that same night. But German forces, alerted by the entire noisy approach, were already moving to cut off the only routes home. The column was surrounded and destroyed the following day. Baum himself was shot, this time in the groin, and captured, along with most of the men still under his command. Of the roughly 307 men who had set out, about 32 were killed, and only around 35 made it back to American lines under their own power. Most of the rest were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Some of them marched into the same camp system the mission had been sent to empty in the first place. Vehicles ran out of fuel in the open, cut off from any resupply, and surrounded by German troops converging from multiple directions, leaving the survivors to fight from stationary positions until ammunition ran out, or the position became hopeless enough to warrant surrender. Some accounts from men who were there describe a final stand fought from tanks that could no longer move, crews firing until their main gun ammunition was gone, and then abandoning the vehicles on foot into terrain crawling with German search parties. Waters and Baum ended up prisoners together at the very camp Baum had just tried to liberate, waiting out the war's final weeks in the company of the men the raid had failed to save. Hammelburg itself was not actually secured for good until roughly 10 days later, when the camp changed hands as part of the broader collapse of German resistance in the area, by which point most of the healthier prisoners, including the surviving remnants of Task Force Baum, had already been marched further east ahead of the front, leaving only the badly wounded and the sick behind for the eventual liberators to find. The fallout inside the American chain of command moved almost as fast as the disaster itself. Omar Bradley, Patton's own superior in the 12th Army Group, later wrote plainly that he had not learned about the mission until it had already been on the road for 2 days, and that if Patton had actually consulted him about it in advance, he would have forbidden the operation outright. Eisenhower's reaction, once the details reached him, was reportedly furious, a level of anger Patton himself later acknowledged in his own account of the aftermath, framing the whole episode afterward as something he had done despite knowing how it would be received, rather than because he believed anyone above him would approve of it in advance. Patton's own public explanation for ordering the raid shifted depending on who was asking. To some, he described it as a legitimate reconnaissance in force, meant to disrupt German rear areas and gather intelligence on enemy strength, with the liberation of prisoners as a secondary benefit, rather than the actual point of the mission. Privately, the letter to his wife, written the same day the task force departed, told a considerably more specific story, one where Waters' name and location were exactly what had prompted the entire operation in the first place. Patton never fully reconciled those two versions of events in any account he made public during his lifetime, and the gap between them is the reason historians still argue over how much of Task Force Baum was really about tactics and how much of it was about a father-in-law who could not stand the idea of leaving Beatrice's husband in a POW camp any longer than he had to. No formal punishment followed. The war in Europe had less than 6 weeks left to run by the time the story fully surfaced, and Eisenhower, whatever his private fury, was not inclined to relieve one of his most effective army commanders over a single, badly judged raid this late in the campaign. That timing mattered more than almost anything else in determining how lightly Patton ultimately paid for the decision. Had the raid happened a year earlier, in the middle of a campaign where Eisenhower still needed to manage Patton's reputation carefully in front of Marshall and the press, the political cost might well have been severe enough to end his command outright, the same way earlier controversies nearly had. In the final weeks of a war that was already effectively won, there was simply less appetite in Washington for a fight over a raid that, however badly judged, had not changed the outcome of anything. Patton kept his command through the rest of the war. The episode nonetheless followed him afterward as one of the clearest examples on record of his willingness to spend his own soldiers' lives on an objective that served him personally as much as it served the wider war effort, a pattern historians studying his career have returned to again and again when weighing his undeniable talent as a commander against the cost his impulsiveness sometimes imposed on the men who had to carry his orders out. Waters survived his wound, survived the rest of his captivity, and was eventually liberated, along with the other prisoners left at Hammelburg, as the front finally caught up with the camp for good. He went on to a long career of his own in the post-war army, eventually reaching 4-star rank, a rise that had nothing to do with his father-in-law's name and everything to do with 2 years spent as a prisoner of war, followed by a raid that had nearly gotten him killed by the very column sent to save him. He rarely spoke publicly about the raid itself in detail for the rest of his life, and when he did, he tended to describe it in measured, understated terms, very much unlike his father-in-law's own style, a survivor's account largely free of the drama that had surrounded the mission meant to rescue him from the moment it was first ordered. The soldiers of Task Force Baum who did not come home from Hammelburg were, for decades afterward, a footnote to a story mostly remembered for its most famous, most controversial detail: that a general had risked an entire task force to reach one particular prisoner, rather than accepting the standard timeline of the war, catching up to the camp on its own. The 32 men killed and the many more captured on the road out were the ones who actually paid for that decision, in a raid whose stated purpose and whose real purpose were never quite the same document, depending on which version of it Patton was telling and to whom. The men who survived the raid and made it back to American lines that week remembered less about strategy or controversy than about the specific hours of the retreat itself. Tanks running dry one by one, the realization spreading through the column that no relief was coming and no path back to friendly territory remained open. And the choice every surviving crew eventually faced between fighting from a position that could not be defended much longer or surrendering to end it. They remembered Captain Baum, wounded and captured alongside the men he had led in, ending up a prisoner inside the very camp system the mission had been built to empty. They remembered, years later, learning that the prisoner they had been sent specifically to find had nearly died in the last few minutes before they reached him, shot by his own side's confusion rather than by anything the raid itself had caused. We should not forget the men of Task Force Baum, sent 50 miles into German territory for a rescue that freed almost none of the prisoners it was sent to save, and cost most of the rescuers everything the mission had asked of them. Did your father or grandfather serve with the 4th Armored Division, or anywhere in the Hammelburg raid of March 1945? Tell us his name in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.